This is very much a session on an overview of high needs. And so by the end of this session, we hope you get a understanding, for those of you new, of the landscape, but also refresh your existing knowledge and updates on how high needs fits in within the work you're doing in the landscape. Format wise, this is what we will be covering in the next sort of 45 minutes, roughly 45 minutes now. We've got an hour and a quarter up to 12:45, so we also have some time for Q&A. But just to give you an overview, I'll be covering the top row as well as the black and aqua blocks, and then Russell Ewins from Funding Policy Unit will be covering the 24-25 updates, and Benedict Coffin from the SEND policy team will be covering the resident and recoupment in the orange block. So there's a lot to cover, but really don't need to worry about all of the detail, as all of the high needs funding framework and how it operates within the SEND Educational Needs and Disability, or SEND system, is covered in this 24-25 edition of the High Needs Operational Guide. It's one document. It sets out all of the main local authorities, or LAs as I call, education provider approaches and respective processes and information for you to make decisions at the local level. Practically speaking, it describes what LA schools, colleges should be taking forward with local authorities and how to help the planning funding arrangements for 24-25. So yeah, it's published a whole 7 to 8 months earlier before the financial year. This came out in July, and 13 to 14 months earlier before the new academic year for schools and colleges. And as I kind of alluded to, unless really pertinent, we should always refer people to the latest guidance, and that's what you should look at, because there are some core messages which may not be year relevant, but which are very which may be updated, and so it's always useful to look back at the current version. So the main changes for 24-25 are covered in section 2 of this guidance, and Russ will be running through those. And the other important section probably you need to look at is section 5, which has got important dates, when a lot of you will be familiar, who've been working in the sector for some time, with some of that. So to contextualise high needs, I wanted to just set out how this funding falls within the rest of the funding landscape. So DfE ESFA allocate school funding to local authorities through 4 distinctive blocks. So schools is the largest, followed by high needs, and then there's early years, and then there's the central schools block for services such as admission. The high needs block supports provision uniquely from children from 0 all the way up to 25. For mainstream schools, there's a significant interplay between the schools block and high needs block of the dedicated schools grant, or DSG. And the allocations of these DSG blocks are made to individual local authorities and calculated for the respective national funding formulas, or NFF. And finally, you should note that for post-16 core funding and sixth forms, this is allocated via distinct funding formula outside of these block allocations. So I've put a definition up. This may sound basic, but the 3 points set out what we mean by high needs funding. You'll observe from that text, in broad terms, high needs is largely a catch-all term confined to funding additional SEND support. And the term high needs is also deployed by the local authority sector, schools and colleges and practitioners, when referring to SEND students with more demanding or complex needs. But the funding may not necessarily flow out of the block. It just depends on individual cases. And most high needs pupils or students will be in possession of an educational healthcare plan, or EHCP, And for those who are not familiar, this is a statutory document covering 0 to 25 age range issued by the local authority, but where the student is normally living, and it sets out the individual needs, support requirements, learning and health interventions and provision. The EHCP is there to ensure the student really progresses through the education system and reaches the potential to required support. And their statutory obligations covered under the 2014 Children's and Family Act, Equality Act, and other legislation which local authorities and public bodies adhere to. I wanted to bring to the fore and highlight, especially to finance colleagues who are represented, the need and support that high needs funding is bridging. We often forget this. So it's principally there to plug the funding gap for some of the most vulnerable, I should say, students or those requiring the most support and provision. And it's therefore both education and support and wider skills support to advance that education and health. So listed in the top of the slide are some of the examples and challenges faced by these students, and at the bottom some of the examples of the type of support the funding is providing to help those falling in those same categories. We don't provide an exhaustive list of what we fund or do not fund, but the regulations and guidance stipulate what we don't cover, and in broad terms it doesn't cover the costs of core education, business support, admin and assessment activity. So to understand further about who the high needs funding block supports, it's probably easier to start by defining the subcategories about age, profile and SEN level. The majority of the high needs budget is allocated at LA level for those pupils and students, as I said, within the HCP. And of course, this is for local authorities and schools and colleges, long-term commitment for many as they work their way through the education system, early years, primary, secondary, and so on. In terms of the categories it falls under, there's four really groups, I guess. There's children aged 0 to 5 with SEND who the LA decides to support from its high needs block, and some of these may have an EHCP. Then you have pupils aged 5 to 19, and this is inclusive of those who turn 19 on or after 31st of August in the academic year, and they will have high levels of SEND in all age ranges of maintained, academy, free schools, FE, there's both general and specialist, Pro 16 or SPIs, and any other settings which receive top-up funding from the high needs budget, and more on that later. And then the third one, you've got those students who fit the 2019-25 age group in FE and SPI settings who have an EHCP and require additional support costing over £6,000. The additional £6,000, I should say, and then all compulsory school age pupils placed in PRUs or other forms of alternative provision by the local authority or the school. And as referenced earlier, beyond local authorities and the sector, there's many parents, schools and practitioners who really don't use the term high needs, and it's important you can count for that in your local offer and related communications. And in part, this is partly due to the way the funding is distributed in how component parts of the funding end up supporting children. Types of SEND as defined by the SEND Code of Practice under those four subcategories. I won't go through them all, but those four headings, you've got cognition and learning, behavioural, emotional and social needs, communication and interaction needs, and then sensory or physical needs. It's worth saying that given the level of need will vary from students to student, and that makes it challenging, but also some students will have comorbidity, which is the presence of more than two conditions. So this creates wider funding and educational support challenges at the local authority, school and college level. A few more points to contextualise high needs funding. In mainstream schools, as I said, there's a significant interplay between in the schools block and what's funded from the high needs block in how the funds are deployed. And each of these allocations to individual LAs is distributed for the funding formula or NFF. And in post 16, as I said, there's a separate NFF. and the NFF produces an amount which is allocated to each of the 153, I think it is, current local authorities we have under the DSG allocation annual process we go through. And then these two columns set out the remit. So on the left, you've got really a summary of the main roles and responsibilities of local authorities. On the right, what the LA High Needs Block is funding from mainstream to specialist provision. And you all know that high needs is obviously the responsibility of each individual LA, and ESFA makes the deductions for the place funding, special schools, and FE and AP academies and free schools, and then also separate deductions for SPIs from the DSG blocks. In other words, the principle we apply is the deductions are made, and then we allocate this. We make the subsequent allocations and adjustments, and for academies we do this and it's represented in their GAG statements or general annual grant. So let's delve into this a bit further. I appreciate some of you will be familiar with the basics of the high need system, but I just want to summarise this at a component level to form the overall funding. Firstly, not all schools and colleges receive all the elements of funding across the three categories I'll go through. And secondly, the funding will be varied according to the settings. So in mainstream schools and post-16, all pupils attract funding, and that's turned into the allocations by the NFF and post-16 NFF. LAs also calculate for schools notional SEND budget, which is included in their schools core allocations, and the schools must fund the first £6,000 of SEND support for individual students, i.e. for modest SEND or high needs. And we've published separate guidance on this notional SEND. And then important to note, mainstream schools, except for those with special units, will not attract place funding, which I said as a separate process set out in the guiding place change guidance. Place funding, so this is allocated as an annual flat rate from the provider LA where the setting is located or headquartered. Place funding is part of the core funding for specialist educational settings and post-16 colleges, and kicking off this month and concluding in March is that process. And then the place notification process. So we expect place numbers to be formally agreed between yourselves, local schools and colleges. So this process ensures that mutual consent arises locally before the place numbers are submitted. And as place funding is core funding for specialist schools and general colleges, they have a guaranteed budget for that academic year, which provides them with a degree of financial stability. And it's probably worth just noting for SEND units and resource provision, the paid rate is either £6,000 or £10,000, and I say either because it depends on if those places are occupied by pupils in the role or not. And then for special schools, aside for independent special schools, pupil referral units and alternative provision academies, the rate allocated is £10,000 per place. And then in further education and SPIs, the post NFF allocation is sometimes known as element 1, and the place funding amount is element 2 or 6K, and we'll come on to that. And there's a lot more here, as you know, in terms of that process, so that's where the guide comes in handy. But just some points in summary: local authorities need to consider the wider strategic considerations that may impact place funding numbers, such as a change in demand, new provision, which alters the mix across schools and colleges, or changes to local arrangements from other commissioning authorities. And then also remember, when agreeing the place number, your local authority needs to take account of the places, as I said, of other commissioning local authorities for which you'll get compensated through the import export process, which is so essentially that should be a consolidated data return you present to us. And then just some more points about place funding. It shouldn't be withdrawn if a place isn't occupied by an individual. Local authorities should not seek to cover, that means for unused places from the previous or current academic year. Local authorities, you shouldn't necessarily be charged an extra 6 or 10k for a learner, or if a school college has filled all the funded places, and this is irrespective of which LA has filled them, given the large number of cross-boundary movement for new students. And for AP-free schools, they agree their future funding directly with ESFA, and as the place funding is provided by us in effect, and LA should use this process to request additional funding for changes in hospital education where there's separate guidance and the updated place change guidance. Then you have top-up funding, and this is what LA's paid directly from their high needs budget. And as I said, I'll cover this in a bit more detail. And then finally, you have service level agreements operating across the country. And this is used where SEND or AP services are commissioned by an LA and funded from its high needs budget in line with the finance regulations. And such services can be commissioned also by schools. In this chart is an illustrative example of core, place and top-up funding in a post-16 settings. Top-up funding. So there's quite a lot on this in the guide, but just to go through some of this, as I said, in post-16, this is known as element 3. And this is funding required over and above the core funding I spoke about, which a school or college receives via the respective NFF or place funding in a specialist or general FE setting to enable a individual student with high needs to participate in education and learning. Top-up funding is paid by the LA where the high needs student lives as they maintain the EHCP. And schools and colleges receive various levels of top-up as determined by the needs of individual pupils or students with high needs to allow them to participate in education and learning. It can often be a point of local contention, as firstly, it could be the majority of funding for a specialist setting for a student. Secondly, the funding comes directly from the main LA and not ESFA. And then thirdly, top-up funding relates to the pupil's needs and provision, which of course vary. And this is an area of the guidance, as I said, we have reviewed and reflected on and taken feedback from the sector such as yourselves, and this has been updated over recent years. So I would ask you to read that section in its entirety. So how is it deployed? The vast majority of top-up funding will be linked to EHC provision and outcomes, but EHCPs are not a prerequisite for accessing top-up funding. The LA which places the pupil or student maintains the EHCP, and as I said, the LA this is normally where the LA where they live, and they pay this to reflect the additional support costs. And then top-up funding should reflect also costs for the schools and colleges accounting for economies and diseconomies of scales, for example, how classrooms may be organised with staff or an under or over occupancy, and then local budget considerations such as overheads, facilities and additional costs being covered. And then just a few points about rates and finance. So these costs should be discussed and top-up funding element agreed in advance. Many local authorities deploy standardized rates or local banding arrangements to reduce very detailed conversation about every single student, but it's also to be mindful of the need to meet the statutory requirements of the Children's and Families Act. And then on payment frequency, monthly payments is normally the default unless you agree otherwise. And also similarly, if you have where you have agreements confirming this, this should set out the rates and support payment schedules in writing. And this is something we receive lots of correspondence about, but the key point is that the payment should be made in a timely manner, and if monthly is the default, as I said, unless you agree otherwise. And if there is a dispute locally about the levels of cost which you're in touch with the school or college about, the main thing is not to delay payments on the agreed amounts, and be clear on what you're disputing or in discussion about, and where you require further evidence. And then just a little bit about the current pressures and reforms. So local authorities' budget pressures and increased deficits, of course, are a big feature in conversation, and top-up funding features are a big part of that. But important that reviews are conducted in line with annual reviews of EHCPs, which of course account for provision for individual students and expected outcomes. And then also the Send an AP improvement plan set out the ambition to move to a national system of bands and tariffs, but that is of course some way off. But yeah, if you want to read further about that, do go back to that document. So we've talked in quite general terms how the funding system and component parts work. So let's look at the funding of the main and college types. And you'll notice a broadly similar approach in this chart. I won't go through all of this slide and the next one, as it's a summary of the main funding table at different levels by different types of educational provider. And just to say, this covers mainstream, resource and special schools. And we've already, as I said, gone through some of the fundamental differences between some of the pre and post 16, but this covers the elements of core, place and top up. And again, in this second slide, it covers the same for PRU's, AP and the FE sector. So you can refer back to this later on. A few points here about some of the pressures and changes in year. So we recognise, within the context of budgets being under pressure, the importance really of working closely with your schools and colleges, because it's very much about relationships and how you communicating any changes. So at the school and college level, it's important to be mindful that the number of high needs pupils and students might be significantly higher than the place funding which has been allocated, and that more funding will be needed in year. So this is usually where the school or college will need to negotiate with you. And as I said, normally if it's across a number of sites, they would negotiate with the provider, local authority, and that's where the school or college is headquarters. Schools and colleges shouldn't try and charge commissioning LAs for extra place funding, and any growth should be discussed and agreed with the provider LA through the import, and LAs will be compensated through the import-export adjustment on the basis of actual high needs pupils or student numbers. And then in-year growth funding should be the result of negotiation about how the extra costs are shared based on the significant level of growth and the extent to which that is reflected in place numbers. And then please note for SPIs and post-16 centrally funded exceptions, these are outside of the place change process, and there's an automatic in-year growth process where we use the independent learning records or ILR data to identify and calculate growth payments. And there's some of the web references to these pages will be provided later. So ESFA acts as a provider local authority for these exceptional requests, and from non-maintained special schools, as I said, SPIs and centrally funded exceptions. So a bit about import-export. You would have received the import-export outcomes, and I'm not going to provide much detail. That there's a separate import-export webinar from early in the year, which is available on our YouTube channel, and a link will be provided to that for those who didn't attend. And a similar teaching will take place for 24-25 as we get nearer to that process. A few points: the import-export adjustment was introduced into the NFF, so local authorities could be compensated for the deductions made from the high needs allocations as a result of the commissioning decisions of other LAs and vice versa. And many of you, of course, will know that a considerable amount of high needs funding is allocated to local authorities based on children and people location, and this is regardless of where they're educated. So we recognise the higher costs local authorities faced, and if they attract more pupils, students with high needs who live outside the area, this means from schools and colleges that these are the imports, and then LAs that export pupils and students to another LA, of course, can face lower costs. So the 6K adjustment ensures the funding system reflects these differences in costs and will be recalculated every year, working outside both the funding floor and application of the gains cap calculation. And the calculation itself is calculated as a net figure based on the following key areas. So it takes into account the number of high needs pupils and students educated at a school college in the local authority, and this minus the number of high needs pupils or students living in that area. And then to get a net number, this is either positive or negative, and it's multiplied by 6,000. It's important to know is for allocate place funding for number maintained special schools and SPIs, and the adjustment is made to the allocation of the LA where the pupil or student is resident, even if the number maintained special school or SPI is situated within the same local authority. And for alternative provision, we don't make any adjustments as the data isn't robust enough. So to ensure the import-export adjustment is correct, it's vital that you really look at the data, but of course press schools and colleges to complete that data or census return accurately. So this is both school census and ILR data. So as I said, most of the timelines happened for 23-24, but here's a summary of the import-export adjustments and some of the key dates for 24-25. And the timeline starts with the data and the guidance being issued and the opportunity for further adjustments to take account of any data errors in the returns from schools and colleges, and then followed by outcomes and DSG updates, as will be the case for this November for 23-24. Separate import-export guidance is issued to LAs as we get closer to adjustment, which will set out some of the points I made, which I appreciate are fairly abstract. And then the import-export process has also been refined from previous years, and we'll continually review your feedback and correspondence to make things a bit more smoother. And we'll be doing that for 23-24 when that's concluded. And then we'll be writing out to LAs shortly with the final outcomes from this year's process, which will form the current 23-24 DSG allocations. This last slide from me at this juncture provides a visual overview of the key dates coming up between now and the end of the current financial year to inform the 24-25 allocations and adjustments. Do take a closer look in the high needs guide under section 5. I'll hand over to Russell to present the second segment of this presentation. So hopefully you found this useful up to this point.
Thank you, Walter. I'll start with this slide, which is a visual representation of the national funding formula, the high needs national funding formula for 24-25. We've changed this slightly, not the structure of the formula itself, just the way it's represented, but it's broadly the same as in previous editions of the high needs operational guide. And it shows the way the calculation works its way into an allocation at the bottom there. As I said, it's the formula for 24-25. So to derive the different allocations for each local authority, we use 13 factors and adjustments. The starting point for the calculation is the basic entitlement factor, which provides a per pupil funding amount for pupils in special schools, and that's subject to an area cost adjustment. The historic spend factor for each LA is then added into the calculation based on 50% of the 2017-18 actual spend of the local authority. Then there are various other factors relating to send and also alternative provision as well that we combine to produce the final allocation for each local authority after the adjustments that have been made for the funding floor and for the gains limit. And there is a couple of extra adjustments there. The AP factor, which covers hospital education and some extra AP funding, and the import-export adjustment that Walter has referred to before. So all the individual high needs allocations and how the calculations have been done for each local authority are published on the high needs NFF tables on gov.uk. So I hope if you've got any queries on that, you'll be able to sort of find out exactly how the calculation has worked. It is quite complicated, but there's lots of information there, and we try and step through the calculation in the various tables that we've produced. So hopefully you can understand, and we try to be as transparent as possible about the data we've used and exactly how the calculation works. So just some changes for 24-25. We've got a higher amount of funding to allocate. It is actually a lower increase in terms of year-on-year funding than in previous years. We have initially allocated over 10.5 billion. Now the vast majority of that is allocated through the NFF, and we publish those allocations in July of each year, and for the 24-25 provisional NFF allocations, they were published in July 23, this last July. And what I would emphasize in looking at those allocations, the importance of understanding those elements of each local authority's funding allocation that are subject to later change. And that's important as you look to planning the budget on a realistic basis leading into the new financial year, because there are changes made. First of all, there are changes when we publish the high needs block in the DSG, and that's in December. But then there are later changes, and of course the deductions that you get notified of early in 2024. So all those elements are decided later. So you do need to take account of that in working out how much you've got to spend in the next financial year. We do hold some funding back initially that is added to the DSG later, and in some cases allocated directly to schools and colleges. That's the 110 million that you can see there. And just a reminder that the funding floor for 24-25 is 3% and the gains limit 5%. These percentages are lower this year than in the previous 2 years of the current 3-year spending period. Another change that we've made is to the Special Schools Minimum Funding Guarantee. This is the protection we offer to schools, the Minimum Funding Guarantee, or MFG. The overall increase, as I've just said, is less next year than in the previous 2 years of this spending period. And so so the minimum increase is lower than across the previous 2 years, and we've set the MFG at 0%. And that is the equivalent to the MFG for mainstream schools. When calculating the MFG, the proposed 24-25 funding levels should be compared with the 23-24 funding levels. We expect local authorities to review their top-up funding levels for all maintained special schools, special academies, to make sure that schools have the funding they need for the increased costs they face, even though there is, in theory, an option to do nothing. So it is important that you look at what your schools are providing and make an assessment of what is needed. for those schools to deliver the placements that each local authority requires. Just a reminder that pupil referral units and AP academies are not included in the MFG rules, but that doesn't mean that local authorities shouldn't consider increases in top-up funding for those institutions as well. Those schools will also be facing cost pressures. So for the MFG, exceptionally, disapplication requests may be made. And the next slide just says a little bit more about that process. I think the main thing to emphasize here is the importance of a conversation with the SFA before putting in a request, and preferably before starting the process of discussion and consultation with schools. Sometimes we found that in the past that prior discussion can lead to a different approach that complies with the MFG requirement. So I'd point you to the guidance, which is Annex 1, on the what should be included in disapplication requests. And what I would also say is that if for those local authorities in the safety valve programme, so one thing that this next slide illustrates is the complexity that has arisen because we've added extra funding streams into the system. Some of which are included in the MFG calculation and others which are not. So I just wanted to highlight that this particular table is something we'll probably try and include into the in the next edition of the High Needs Operational Guide once we've got more information about the new teachers' pensions grant for 24-25. It does mention the Teachers Pay Additional Grant there, the TPAG grant, the additional funding, which is the 3.4% equivalent to the mainstream schools additional grant this year, which is continuing next year, and the historic pay and pensions funding, previous teachers' pay and pensions grants, that continues to be paid as a separate funding stream. So those funding streams are all in addition to the place funding at £10,000 per place. And there is a requirement in the conditions of grant for local authorities to pay that to the relevant schools. I would just urge you really to sort of focus on the relevant parts of the High Needs Operational Guide to look to see how those calculations need to be done, because they are quite specific in some instances about how the allocations are to be done, particularly for the additional grant, the additional funding that we've allocated this year and into next year. There's also the scope for disapplications on some of that as well. I just wanted to mention one other change, and that is that we're intending to amend the regulations covering the use of DSG funding for young people aged 19 and over in schools. It's really a technical change to make the law consistent between special schools and secondary schools. But the basic principle remains that young people aged 19 and over who are starting their further education not only require an education, health and care plan to receive funding from the DSG, but must not receive their education in a school setting. But again, exceptions can be made through the disapplication process, which hasn't changed. That's all from me, and I'm now going to hand over to Benedict.
The slide I'd like to talk about is around residence and also recoupment. This is an area where we get a reasonable number of queries relating to children and young people who move between local authorities. And this slide essentially quotes from, I think it's Annex 3 of the High Needs Operational Guidance, section 18 in this year's version. Local authorities are statutorily responsible for the special educational needs of the children and young people in their area. That's the formulation in the Children and Families Act 2014. And that includes the duty to secure the special education funding for children and young people who live in one local authority but are educated in another one is covered through the import-export adjustment. And we consider that a residential education placement does not mean a change of your residence. Even when you are in 52-week residential provision, the child or young person is still considered to live at their family home. And therefore, the local authority where their parents live would be responsible for commissioning the placement and usually for funding it. However, a real social care placement for someone over 18, therefore an adult, might mean a change in residence. That's something to look at carefully and on a case-by-case basis. The key point being, local authorities are statutorily responsible for maintaining the EHC plans of the children and young people who live in their area, including responsibility for securing and normally for funding that provision. This gets trickier where we get to the recoupment of costs relating to looked after children. The recoupment regulations permit the home local authority, where a looked after child lives, to recoup the costs of primary and secondary education, significantly but not further education, from the local authority which looks after them. Historically, local authorities relied on recoupment arrangements where looked after children were placed away from the looking after LA. But the introduction of the High Needs National Funding Formula and therefore allocating funding based on the characteristic of the child live in an area mean recoupment should therefore only be necessary on an exceptional basis. For example, exceptional circumstances might include cross-border placements into Wales, where the funding system is different, or very short-term or temporary placements, which would not necessarily mean that the responsibility for maintaining the EHC plan will be transferred because the provision was not expected to be a transfer in the long term. In such cases, the looking after local authority might want to consider funding the provision directly. We've said a bit more about this in the operational guidance, and that's the highlighted wording at the bottom of this slide. The key word here around recoupment is the need for agreement between the local authorities. This discussion. So the key things to take away here: responsibility for maintaining an EHC of the young person, including child, is resident where they live. Responsibility for funding the provision in an EHC plan through top-up funding generally falls to that same local authority.
Just reiterate the important messages that we want local authorities to understand. The responsibility for maintaining an EHC plan falls to the local authority where the child, including a looked after child, is resident. The responsibility for funding the provision in a plan through high needs top-up funding would normally fall to that same authority, and the cost should not normally be passed on to another authority, even in the case of a looked after child. But exceptions can be made. These depend on local authorities coming to an agreement on proportionate sharing of costs, which is in the best interests of children. The current legislation doesn't provide a clear answer, and litigation is not a solution. So just to emphasize again the importance of local authorities agreeing between themselves where there is a need for recoupment.
So we're just coming up to the end. Some further information here about what we've discussed in a related topic. So this covers in broad terms funding, some data and send information. And there's a breadth of information on dfe-esfa.gov pages. And so these links will become alive when you see the slides circulated to you. And yeah, as I said, there's also links embedded in the 24-25 guide as well. So just really leads me at this stage to say thanks for listening. Hopefully that's all been helpful. Here's the contact information for specific subject-based queries that gets disseminated to some specialist teams.